Hello, everyone. You're here with me, so it must obviously be bedtime. All right. Tonight we're going to read Nicholas Nickleby some more by Charles Dickens. Thank you very much for joining me, and I do hope you enjoy the story. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. Chapter 4. Nicholas and his uncle, to secure the fortune without loss of time, wait upon Mr. Wackford Squeers, the Yorkshire schoolmaster. Snow Hill. What kind of place can the quiet townspeople, who see the words emblazoned in all the legibility of gilt letters and dark shading on the North Country coaches, take Snow Hill to be? All people have some undefined and shadowy notion of a place whose name is frequently before their eyes, or often in their ears. What a vast number of random ideas there must be perpetually floating about regarding this same Snow Hill. The name is such a good one. Snow Hill. Snow Hill, too, coupled with a Saracen's Head, picturing to us by a double association of ideas something stern and rugged. A bleak, desolate tract of country, open to piercing blasts and fierce wintry storms. A dark, cold, gloomy heath, lonely by day, and scarcely to be thought of by honest folks at night. A place which solitary wayfarers shun, and where desperate robbers congregate. This, or something like this, should be the prevalent notion of Snow Hill, in those remote and rustic parts through which the Saracen's Head, like some grim apparition, rushes each day and night with mysterious and ghost-like punctuality, holding its swift and headlong course in all weathers, and seeming to bid defiance to the very elements themselves. The reality is rather different, but by no means to be despised notwithstanding. There, at the very core of London, in the heart of its business and animation, in the midst of a whirl of noise and motion, stemming as it were the giant currents of life that flow ceaselessly on from different quarters and meet beneath its walls, stands Newgate. And in that crowded street on which it frowns so darkly, within a few feet of the squalid, tottering houses, upon the very spot on which the vendors of soup and fish and damaged fruit are now plying their trades, scores of human beings, amidst a roar of sounds to which even the tumult of a great city is as nothing, 4, 6, or 8 strong men at a time, have been hurried violently and swiftly from the world, when the scene has been rendered frightful with excess of human life, when curious eyes have glared from casement and housetop, and wall and pillar, and when, in the mass of white and upturned faces, the dying wretch, in his all-comprehensive look of agony, has met not one that bore the impress of pity or compassion. Near to the jail, and by consequence near to Smithfield also, and the Compter, and the bustle and noise of the city, and just on that particular part of Snow Hill where omnibus horses going eastward seriously think of falling down on purpose, and where horses and hackney cabriolets going westward not unfrequently fall by accident, is the coachyard of the Saracen's Head Inn, its portal guarded by 2 Saracen's heads and shoulders, which it was once the pride and glory of the choice spirits of this metropolis to pull down at night, but which have for some time remained in undisturbed tranquillity, possibly because this species of humor is now confined to St. James Parish, where door-knockers are preferred as being more portable, and bell-wires esteemed as convenient toothpicks. Whether this be the reason or not, there they are, frowning upon you from each side of the gateway. The inn itself, garnished with another Saracen's Head, frowns upon you from the top of the yard, where from the door of the hind boot of all the red coaches that are standing therein, there glares a small Saracen's Head, with a twin expression to the large Saracen's Heads below, so that the general appearance of the pile is decidedly of the Saracenic order. When you walk up this yard, you will see the booking office on your left, and the tower of St. Sepulchre's Church, darting abruptly up into the sky on your right, and a gallery of bedrooms on both sides. Just before you, you will observe a long window with the words "Coffee Room" legibly painted above it, and looking out of that window, you would have seen, in addition, if you had gone at the right time, Mr. Wackford Squeers, with his hands in his pockets. Mr. Squeer's appearance was not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favor of two. The eye he had was unquestionably useful, but decidedly not ornamental, being of a greenish gray, and in shape resembling the fanlight of a street door. The blank side of his face was much wrinkled and puckered up, which gave him a very sinister appearance, especially when he smiled, at which times his expression bordered closely on the villainous. His hair was very flat and shiny, save at the ends where it was brushed stiffly up from a low protruding forehead, which assorted well with his harsh voice and coarse manner. He was about 2 or 3 and 50, and a trifle below the middle size. He wore a white neckerchief with long ends, and a suit of scholastic black, but his coat sleeves, being a great deal too long, and his trousers a great deal too short, he appeared ill at ease in his clothes, and as if he were in a perpetual state of astonishment at finding himself so respectable. Hello, Meg. Mr. Squeers was standing in a box by one of the coffee room fireplaces, fitted with one such table as is usually seen in coffee rooms, and 2 of extraordinary shapes and dimensions made to suit the angles of the partition. In a corner of the seat was a very small deal trunk, tied round with a scanty piece of cord, and on the trunk was perched, his lace-up half-boots and corduroy trousers dangling in the air, a diminutive boy, with his shoulders drawn up to his ears and his hands planted on his knees, who glanced timidly at the schoolmaster, from time to time with evident dread and apprehension. 3:30, muttered Mr. Squeers, turning from the window and looking sulkily at the coffee-room clock. There will be nobody here today. Much vexed by this reflection, Mr. Squeers looked at the little boy to see whether he was doing anything he could beat him for. As he happened not to be doing anything at all, he merely boxed his ears and told him not to do it again. At midsummer, muttered Mr. Squeers, resuming his complaint, I took down 10 boys. 10 20s is £200. I go back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I've got only 3. 3 oughts is an ought. 3 2s is £60. What's come of all the boys? What's parents got in their heads? What does it all mean? I swear, so many of the authors that we have their characters crying out, what does it mean? Here the little boy on top of the trunk gave a violent sneeze. Hullo, sir, growled the schoolmaster, turning round. What's that, sir? Nothing, please, sir, replied the little boy. Nothing, sir, exclaimed Mr. Squeers. Please, sir, I sneezed, rejoined the boy, trembling till the little trunk shook under him. Oh, sneezed, did you? Retorted Mr. Squeers. Then what did you say nothing for, sir? In default of a better answer to this question, the little boy screwed a couple of knuckles into each of his eyes and began to cry, wherefore Mr. Squeers knocked him off the trunk with a blow on one side of the face, and knocked him on again with a blow on the other. Oh, I do not like Mr. Squeers, that's for sure. Wait till I get you down into Yorkshire, my young gentleman, said Mr. Squeers, and then I'll give you the rest. Will you hold that noise, sir? Yes, sobbed the little boy, rubbing his face very hard with the beggar's petition in printed calico. Then do so at once, sir, said Squeers. Do you hear? As this admonition was accompanied with a threatening gesture, and uttered with a savage aspect, the little boy rubbed his face harder, as if to keep the tears back, and beyond alternately sniffling and choking, gave no further vent to his emotions. Apparently... Well, hello, Alex. Lovely to see you in here. I'm glad you could make it. And please ignore the poll. Apparently I did not get it turned off from the Agatha Christie stream. I'm going to see if I can turn it off really quick. Unless, of course, you want to vote for who the murderer is on a completely different story. That'd be all right. All right, let's see. Polls. Close poll. Okay. There we go. All fixed. Too late, fella. Too late. Mr. Squeers, said the waiter, looking in at this juncture. Here's a gentleman asking for you at the bar. Show the gentleman in, Richard, replied Mr. Squeers in a soft voice. Put your handkerchief in your pocket, you little scoundrel, or I'll murder you when the gentleman goes. The schoolmaster had scarcely uttered these words in a fierce whisper when the stranger entered. Affecting not to see him, Mr. Squeers feigned to be intent upon mending a pen and offering benevolent advice to his youthful pupil. My dear child, said Mr. Squeers, all people have their trials. This early trial of yours that is fit to make your little heart burst, and your very eyes come out of your head with crying. What is it? Nothing. Less than nothing. You are leaving your friends, but you will have a father in me, my dear, and a mother in Mrs. Squeers, at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, where youth are boarded, clothed, booked, washed, furnished with pocket money, provided with all necessaries. It is the gentleman, observed the stranger, stopping the schoolmaster in the rehearsal of his advertisement. Mr. Squeers, I believe, sir? The same, sir, said Mr. Squeers, with an assumption of extreme surprise. The gentleman, said the stranger, that advertised in the Times newspaper. Morning Post, Chronicle, Herald, and Advertiser, regarding the academy called Dotheboys Hall at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, added Mr. Squeers. You come on business, sir. I see by my young friends. How do you do, my little gentleman, and how do you do, sir? With this salutation, Mr. Squeers patted the heads of two hollow-eyed, small-boned little boys, whom the applicant had brought with him, and waited for further communications. I am in the oil and colour way. My name is Snawley, sir, said the stranger. Squeers inclined his head as much as to say, and a remarkably pretty name, too. The stranger continued, I have been thinking, Mr. Squeers, of placing my two boys at your school. It is not for me to say so, sir, replied Mr. Squeers, but I don't think you could possibly do a better thing. Said the other. £20 per annum, I believe, Mr. Squeers. Guineas, rejoined the schoolmaster, with a persuasive smile. Pounds for two, I think, Mr. Squeers, said Mr. Snawley solemnly. I don't think it could be done, sir, replied Squeers, as if he had never considered the proposition before. Let me see. 4 5s is 20. Double that and deduct the... Well, £1 either way shall not stand betwixt us. You must recommend me to your connection, sir, and make it up that way. They're not great eaters, said Mr. Snawley. Oh, that doesn't matter at all, replied Squeers. We don't consider the boys' appetites at our establishment. This was strictly true. They did not. Every wholesome luxury, sir, that Yorkshire can afford, continued Squeers, every beautiful moral that Mrs. Squeers can instill, in short, every comfort of a home that a boy could wish for will be theirs, Mr. Snawley. I should wish their morals to be particularly attended to, said Mr. Snawley. I'm glad of that, sir, replied the schoolmaster, drawing himself up. They have come to the right shop for morals, sir. You are a moral man yourself, said Mr. Snawley. I rather believe I am, sir, replied Squeers. I have the satisfaction to know you are, sir, said Mr. Snawley. I asked one of your references, and he said you were pious. Well, sir, I hope I am a little in that line, replied Squeers. I hope I am also, rejoined the other. Could I say a few words with you in the next box? Let's see if we can get rid of that guy. And there we go. He's banned. Don't need spamming advertisements in here. By all means, rejoined Squeers with a grin. My dears, will you speak to your new playfellow a minute or two? This is one of my boys, sir. Belling, his name is. A Taunton boy, that, sir. Is he indeed? Rejoined Mr. Snawley, looking at the poor little urchin as if he were some extraordinary natural curiosity. He goes down with me tomorrow, sirs. Sir, said Squeers. That's his luggage that he is sitting upon now. Each boy is required to bring, sir, 2 suits of clothes, 6 shirts, 6 pair of stockings, 2 nightcaps, 2 pocket handkerchiefs, 2 pair of shoes, 2 hats, and a razor. A razor! Exclaimed Mr. Snawley, as they walked into the next box. What for? To shave with, replied Squeers, in a slow and measured tone. There was not much in these 3 words, but there must have been something in the manner in which they were said to attract attention. For the schoolmaster and his companion looked steadily at each other for a few seconds, and then exchanged a very meaning smile. Snawley was a sleek, flat-nosed man, clad in somber garments and long black gaiters, and bearing in his countenance an expression of much mortification and sanctity. So, his smiling without any obvious reason was the more remarkable. Up to what age do you keep boys at your school, then? He asked at length. Just as long as their friends make the quarterly payments to my agent in town, or until such time as they run away, replied Squeers. Let us understand each other. I see we may safely do so. What are these boys? Natural children? No, rejoined Snawley, meeting the gaze of the schoolmaster's one eye. They ain't. I thought they might be, said Squeers coolly. We have a good many of them. That boy is one. Him in the next box, said Snawley. Squeers nodded in the affirmative. His companion took another peep at the little boy on the trunk, and turning round again, looked as if he were quite disappointed to see him so much like other boys, and said he should hardly have thought it. He is, cried Squeers. But about these boys of yours, you wanted to speak to me. Yes, replied Snawley. The fact is, I am not their father, Mr. Squeers. I'm only their father-in-law. Oh, is that it? Said the schoolmaster. That explains it at once. I was wondering what the devil you were going to send them to Yorkshire for. Ha! Oh, I understand now. You see, I have married the mother, pursued Snawley. It's expensive keeping boys at home. And as she has a little money in her own right, I am afraid, women are so very foolish, Mr. Squeers, that she might be led to squander it on them, which would be their ruin, you know. I see, returned Squeers, throwing himself back in his chair and waving his hand. And this, resumed Snawley, has made me anxious to put them to some school a good distance off, where there are no holidays, none of those ill-judged coming home twice a year that unsettle children's minds so, and where they may rough it a little. You comprehend? The payment's regular, and no questions asked, said Squeers, nodding his head. That's it, exactly, rejoined the other. Morals strictly attended to, though. Strictly, said Squeers. Not too much writing home allowed, I suppose, said the father-in-law, hesitating. None, except a circular at Christmas, to say they never were so happy, and hope they may never be sent for, rejoined Squeers. Nothing could be better, said the father-in-law, rubbing his hands. Then, as we understand each other, said Squeers, will you allow me to ask whether you consider me a highly virtuous, exemplary, and well-conducted man in private life, and whether, as a person whose business it is to take charge of youth, you place the strongest confidence in my unimpeachable integrity, liberality, religious principles, and ability? Certainly I do, replied the father-in-law, reciprocating the schoolmaster's grin. Perhaps you won't object to say that, if I make you a reference? Not the least in the world. That's your sort, said Squeers, taking up a pen. This is doing business, and that's what I like. Having entered Mr. Snawley's address, the schoolmaster had next to perform the still more agreeable office of entering the receipt of the first quarter's payment in advance, which he had scarcely completed when another voice was heard inquiring for Mr. Squeers. Here he is, replied the schoolmaster. What is it? Only a matter of business, sir, said Ralph Nickelby, presenting himself, closely followed by Nicholas. There was an advertisement of yours in the paper this morning. There was, sir. This way, if you please, said Squeers, who had, by this time, got back to the box by the fireplace. Won't you be seated? Why, I think I will, replied Ralph, suiting the action to the word, and placing his hat on the table before him. This is my nephew, sir, Mr. Nicholas Nickelby. Yes, this is indeed the Muffin Book. Welcome, Panda. Glad to see you here. Glad you could make it. How do you do, sir? Said Squeers. Nicholas bowed, said he was very well, and seemed very much astonished at the outward appearance of the proprietor of Dotheboys Hall, as indeed he was. Perhaps you recollect me, said Ralph, looking narrowly at the schoolmaster. You paid me a small account at each of my half-yearly visits to town, for some years, I think, sir, replied Squeers. I did, rejoined Ralph, for the parents of a boy named Dorker, who unfortunately died at Dotheboys Hall, said Ralph, finishing the sentence. I remember very well, sir, rejoined Squeers. Ah, Mrs. Squeers, sir, was as partial to that lad as if he had been her own. The attention, sir, that was bestowed upon that boy in his illness. Dry toast and warm tea offered him every night and morning when he couldn't swallow anything. A candle in his bedroom on the very night he died. The best dictionary sent up for him to lay his head upon. I don't regret it, though. It is a pleasant thing to reflect that one did one's duty by him. Ralph smiled, as if he meant anything but smiling, and looked round at the strangers present. These are only some pupils of mine, said Wackford Squeers, pointing to the little boy on the trunk, and the two little boys on the floor, who had been staring at each other without uttering a word, and writhing their bodies into most remarkable contortions, according to the custom of little boys when they first become acquainted. This gentleman, sir, is a parent who is kind enough to compliment me upon the course of education adopted at Dotheboys Hall, which is situated, sir, at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, where youth are boarded, clothed, booked, washed, furnished with pocket money. Yes, we know all about that, sir, interrupted Ralph testily. It's in the advertisement. You're very right, sir. It is in the advertisement, replied Squeers. And in the matter of fact besides, interrupted Mr. Snawley, I feel bound to assure you, sir, and I am proud to have this opportunity of assuring you, that I consider Mr. Squeers a gentleman highly virtuous, exemplary, well-conducted, and— I make no doubt of it, sir, interrupted Ralph, checking the torrent of recommendation. No doubt of it at all. Suppose we come to business. With all my heart, sir, rejoined Squeers. Never postpone business is the very first lesson we instill into our commercial pupils. Master Billing, my dear, always remember that. Do you hear? Yes, sir, repeated Master Belling. He recollects what it is, does he? Said Ralph. Tell the gentleman, said Squeers. Never, repeated Master Belling. Very good, said Squeers. Go on. Never, repeated Master Belling again. Very good indeed, said Squeers. Yes. P, suggested Nicholas good-naturedly. Perform business, said Master Belling. Never perform business. Very well, sir, said Squeers, darting a withering look at the culprit. You and I will perform a little business on our private account by and by. And just now, said Ralph, we had better transact our own, perhaps. If you please, said Squeers. Well, resumed Ralph, it's brief enough, soon broached, and I hope easily concluded. You have advertised for an able assistant, sir. Precisely so, said Squeers. And you really want one? Certainly, answered Squeers. Here he is, said Ralph, my nephew Nicholas, hot from school with everything he learnt there, fermenting in his head, and nothing fermenting in his pocket, is just the man you want. I am afraid, said Squeers, perplexed with such an application from a youth of Nicholas's figure. I am afraid the young man won't suit me. Yes, he will, said Ralph. I know better. Don't be cast down, sir. You will be teaching all the young noblemen in Dotheboys Hall in less than a week's time, unless this gentleman is more obstinate than I take him to be. I fear, sir, said Nicholas, addressing Mr. Squeers, that you object to my youth, and to my not being a master of arts. The absence of a college degree is an objection, replied Squeers, looking as grave as he could, and considerably puzzled, no less by the contrast between the simplicity of the nephew and the worldly manner of the uncle, than by the incomprehensible allusion to the young nobleman under his tuition. Look here, sir, said Ralph. I'll put this matter in its true light in 2 seconds. If you'll have the goodness, rejoined Squeers. This is a boy, or a youth, or a lad, or a young man, or a hobbly-hoy, or whatever you like to call him, of 18 or 19 or thereabouts, said Ralph. That I see, observed the schoolmaster. So do I, said Mr. Snawley, thinking it as well to back his new friend occasionally. His father is dead. He is wholly ignorant of the world, has no resources whatsoever, and wants something to do, said Ralph. I recommend him to this splendid establishment of yours, as an opening which will lead him to fortune if he turns it to proper account. Do you see that? Everybody must see that, replied Squeers, half imitating the sneer with which the old gentleman was regarding his unconscious relative. I do, of course, said Nicholas eagerly. He does, of course, you observe, said Ralph in the same dry, hard manner. If any caprice of temper should induce him to cast aside this golden opportunity before he has brought it to perfection, I consider myself absolved from extending any assistance to his mother and sister. Look at him, and think of the use he may be to you in 6 ways. Now, the question is whether, for some time to come at all events, he won't serve your purpose better than 20 of the kind of people you would get under ordinary circumstances. Isn't that a question for consideration? Yes, it is, said Squeers, answering a nod of Ralph's head with a nod of his own. Good, rejoined Ralph. Let me have 2 words with you. The 2 words were had apart. In a couple of minutes, Mr. Wackford Squeers announced that Mr. Nicholas Nickelby was, from that moment, thoroughly nominated to, and installed in, the office of first assistant master at Dotheboys Hall. Your uncle's recommendation has done it, Mr. Nickelby, said Wackford Squeers. Nicholas, overjoyed at his success, shook his uncle's hand warmly, and could almost have worshipped Squeers upon the spot. He is an odd-looking man, thought Nicholas. What of that? Porson was an odd-looking man, and so was Dr. Johnson. All these bookworms are. At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mr. Nickelby, said Squeers, the coach starts. You must be here at 4:15, as we are to take these boys with us. Certainly, sir, said Nicholas. And your fare down I have paid, growled Ralph, so you'll have nothing to do but keep yourself warm. Here was another instance of his uncle's generosity. Nicholas felt his unexpected kindness so much that he could scarcely find words to thank him. Indeed, he had not found half enough. When they took leave of the schoolmaster and emerged from the Saracen's Head gateway. I shall be here in the morning to see you fairly off, said Ralph. No skulking. Thank you, sir, replied Nicholas. I shall never forget this kindness. Take care you don't, replied his uncle. You had better go home now, and pack up what you have got to pack. Do you think you could find your way to Golden Square first? Certainly, said Nicholas. I can easily inquire. Leave these papers with my clerk, then, said Ralph, producing a small parcel, and tell him to wait till I come home. Nicholas cheerfully undertook the errand, and bidding his worthy uncle an affectionate farewell, which that warm-hearted old gentleman acknowledged by a growl, hastened away to execute his commission. He found Golden Square in due course. Mr. Noggs, who had stepped out for a minute or so to the public-house, was opening the door with a latch-key as he reached the steps. "What's that?" inquired Noggs, pointing to the parcel. "Papers for my uncle," replied Nicholas, "and you are to have the goodness to wait till he comes home, if you please." "Uncle!" cried Noggs. "Mr. Nickelby," said Nicholas in explanation. "Come in," said Newman. Without another word he led Nicholas into the passage, and thence into the official pantry at the end of it, where he thrust him into a chair and, mounting upon his high stool, sat, with his arms hanging straight down by his sides, gazing fixedly upon him, as from a tower of observation. "There's no answer," said Nicholas, laying the parcel on a table beside him. Nicholas said nothing, but folding his arms and thrusting his head forward, so as to obtain a nearer view of Nicholas's face, scanned his feature closely. "No answer," said Nicholas, speaking very loud, under the impression that Newman Noggs was deaf. Newman placed his hands upon his knees, and without uttering a syllable, continued the same close scrutiny of his companion's face. This was such a very singular proceeding on the part of an utter stranger, and his appearance was so extremely peculiar, that Nicholas, who had a sufficiently keen sense of the ridiculous, could not refrain from breaking into a smile, as he inquired whether Mr. Noggs had any commands for him. Noggs shook his head and sighed, upon which Nicholas rose, and remarking that he required no rest, bade him good morning. It was a great exertion for Newman Noggs, and nobody knows to this day how he ever came to make it, the other party being wholly unknown to him. But he drew a long breath and actually said, out loud, without once stopping, that if the young gentleman did not object to tell, he should like to know what his uncle was going to do for him. Nicholas had not the least objection in the world, but on the contrary was rather pleased to have an opportunity of talking on the subject which occupied his thoughts. So he sat down again, and, his sanguine imagination warming as he spoke, entered into a fervent and glowing description of all the honours and advantages to be derived from his appointment at that seat of learning, Dotheboys Hall. "But what's the matter? Are you ill?" said Nicholas, suddenly breaking off, as his companion, after throwing himself into a variety of uncouth attitudes, thrust his hands under the stool, and cracking his finger joints as if he were snapping all the bones in his hands. Newman Noggs made no reply, but went on shrugging his shoulders and cracking his finger joints, smiling horribly all the time, and looking steadfastly at nothing, out of the tops of his eyes in a most ghastly manner. At first, Nicholas thought the mysterious man was in a fit, but on further consideration decided that he was in liquor, under which circumstances he deemed it prudent to make off at once. He looked back when he had got the street door open. Newman Noggs was still indulging in the same extraordinary gestures, and the cracking of his fingers sounded louder than ever. So many muffins and crumpets. I'm still waiting for the chance to read Panda's muffin and crumpet fanfic. Should be quite the scandalous thing. Chapter 5. Nicholas starts for Yorkshire, of his leave-taking and his fellow travellers, and what befell them on the road. If tears dropped into a trunk were charms to preserve its owner from sorrow and misfortune, Nicholas Nickelby would have commenced his expedition under most happy auspices. There was so much to be done, and so little time to do it in, so many kind words to be spoken, and such bitter pain in the hearts in which they rose to impede their utterance, that the little preparations for his journey were made mournfully indeed. 100 things which the anxious care of his mother and sister deemed indispensable for his comfort, Nicholas insisted on leaving behind, as they might prove of some after use, or might be converted into money if occasion required. 100 affectionate contests on such points as these took place on the sad night which preceded his departure, and, as the termination of every angerless dispute brought them nearer and nearer to the close of their slight preparations, Kate grew busier and wept more silently. The box was packed at last, and then there came supper, with some little delicacy provided for the occasion, and as a set-off against the expense of which Kate and her mother had feigned to dine when Nicholas was out. The poor lad nearly choked himself by attempting to partake of it, and almost suffocated himself in affecting a jest or two, and forcing a melancholy laugh. Thus they lingered on till the hour of separating, for the night was long past, and then they found that they might as well have given vent to their real feelings before, for they could not suppress them, do what they would, so they let them have their way, and even that was a relief. Nicholas slept well till 6 next morning, dreamed of home, or of what was once home, no matter which, for things that are changed or gone will come back as they used to be, thank God, in sleep, and rose quite brisk and gay. He wrote a few lines in pencil to say the goodbye which he was afraid to pronounce himself, and laying them, with half his scanty stock of money, at his sister's door, shouldered his box and crept softly downstairs. "Is that you, Hannah?" cried a voice from Miss La Creevy's sitting room, whence shone the light of a feeble candle. "It is I, Miss La Creevy," said Nicholas, putting down the box and looking in. "Bless us!" exclaimed Miss La Creevy, starting and putting her hand to her curl papers. "You're up very early, Mr. Nickelby." "So are you," replied Nicholas. "It's the fine arts that bring me out of bed, Mr. Nickelby," returned the lady. "I'm waiting for the light to carry out an idea." Miss La Creevy had gotten up early, put a fancy nose into a miniature of an ugly little boy, destined for his grandmother in the country, who was expected to bequeath him property if he was like the family. "To carry out an idea," replied Mrs. Creevy, "and that's the great convenience of living in a thoroughfare like the Strand. When I want a nose or an eye for any particular sitter, I have only to look out of the window and wait till I get one." "Does it take long to get a nose now?" inquired Nicholas, smiling. "Why, that depends in a great measure on the pattern," replied Miss La Creevy. "Snubs and Romans are plentiful enough, and there are flats of all sorts and sizes when there's a meeting at Exeter Hall. But perfect aquilines, I am sorry to say, are scarce, and we generally use them for uniforms or public characters." "Indeed," said Nicholas, "if I should meet with any in my travels, I'll endeavor to sketch them for you." "You don't mean to say that you are really going all the way down into Yorkshire this cold winter's weather, Mr. Nickelby?" said Miss La Creevy. "I heard something of it last night." "I do indeed," replied Nicholas. "Needs must, you know, when somebody drives. Necessity is my driver, and that is only another name for the same gentleman." "Well, I am very sorry for it, that's all I can say," said Miss La Creevy, "as much on your mother and sister's account as on yours. Your sister is a very pretty young lady, Mr. Nickelby, and that is an additional reason why she should have somebody to protect her. I persuaded her to give me a sitting or two for the street door case. Ah, she'll make a sweet miniature." As Miss La Creevy spoke, she held up an ivory countenance intersected with a very perceptible sky-blue veins, and regarded it with so much complacency that Nicholas quite envied her. "If you ever have an opportunity of showing Kate some little kindness," said Nicholas, presenting his hand, "I think you will." "Depend upon that," said the good-natured miniature painter, "and God bless you, Mr. Nickelby, and I wish you well." It was very little that Nicholas knew of the world, but he guessed enough about its ways to think that if he gave Miss La Creevy one little kiss, perhaps she might not be the less kindly disposed towards those he was leaving behind. So he gave her 3 or 4 with a kind of jocose gallantry, and Miss La Creevy evinced no greater symptoms of displeasure than declaring, as she adjusted her yellow turban, that she had never heard of such a thing, and couldn't have believed it possible. Having terminated the unexpected interview in this satisfactory manner, Nicholas hastily withdrew himself from the house. By the time he had found a man to carry his box, it was only 7 o'clock, so he walked slowly on, a little in advance of the porter, and very probably with not half as light a heart in his breast as the man had, although he had no waistcoat to cover it with, and had evidently, from the appearance of his other garments, been spending the night in a stable and taking his breakfast at a pump. Regarding with no small curiosity and interest all the busy preparations for the coming day which every street and almost every house displayed, and thinking, now and then, that it seemed rather hard that so many people of all ranks and stations could earn a livelihood in London, and that he should be compelled to journey so far in search of one, Nicholas speedily arrived at the Saracen's Head, Snow Hill. Having dismissed his attendant and seen the box safely deposited in the coach office, he looked into the coffee-room in search of Mr. Squires. He found that learned gentleman sitting at breakfast, with the 3 little boys before noticed, and 2 others who had turned up by some lucky chance since the interview of the previous day, ranged in a row upon the opposite seat. Mr. Squeers had brought before him a small measure of coffee, a plate of hot toast, and a cold round of beef, but he was at that moment intent on preparing breakfast for the little boys. "This is 2 pinnaforth of milk, is it, waiter?" said Mr. Squeers, looking down into a large blue mug, and slanting it gently so as to get an accurate view of the quantity of liquid contained in it. "That's 2 penn'orth, sir," replied the waiter. "What a rare article milk is, to be sure, in London," said Mr. Squeers, with a sigh. "Just fill that mug up with lukewarm water, William, will you?" "To the very top, sir?" inquired the waiter. "Why, the milk will be drowned." "Never you mind that," replied Mr. Squeers. "Serve it right for being so dear. You ordered that thick bread and butter for 3, did you?" "Coming directly, sir." "You needn't hurry yourself," said Squeers. "There's plenty of time. Conquer your passions, boys, and don't be eager after victuals." As he uttered this moral precept, Mr. Squeers took a large bite out of the cold beef, and recognized Nicholas. "Sit down, Mr. Nickelby," said Squeers. "Here we are, a-breakfasting, you see." Nicholas did not see that anybody was breakfasting except Mr. Squeers, but he bowed with all becoming reverence, and looked as cheerful as he could. "Oh, that's the milk and water, is it, William?" said Squeers. "Very good. Don't forget the bread and butter presently." At this fresh mention of the bread and butter, the 5 little boys looked very eager, and followed the waiter out with their eyes. Meanwhile, Mr. Squeers tasted the milk and water. "Ah," said that gentleman, smacking his lips, "here's richness. Think of the many beggars and orphans in the streets that would be glad of this, little boys. A shocking thing, hunger, isn't it, Mr. Nickelby?" "Very shocking, sir," said Nicholas. "When I say number 1, pursued Mr. Squeers, putting the mug before the children, the boy on the left hand nearest the window may take a drink. And when I say number 2, the boy next to him will go in, and so till we come to number 5, which is the last boy. Are you ready?" "Yes, sir," cried all the little boys, with great eagerness. "That's right," said Squeers, calmly getting on with his breakfast. "Keep ready till I tell you to begin. Subdue your appetites, my dears, and you've conquered human nature. This is the way we inculcate strength of mind, Mr. Nickelby," said the schoolmaster, turning to Nicholas, and speaking with his mouth very full of beef and toast. Nicholas murmured something, he knew not what, in reply, and the little boys, dividing their gaze between the mug, the bread, and butter, which had by this time arrived, and every morsel which Mr. Squeers took into his mouth, remained with strained eyes and torments of expectation. "Thank God for a good breakfast," said Squeers, when he had finished. "Number 1 may take a drink." Number 1 seized the mug ravenously, and had just drunk enough to make him wish for more, when Mr. Squeers gave the signal for number 2, who gave up at the same interesting moment to number 3, and the process was repeated until the milk and water terminated with number 5. "And now," said the schoolmaster, dividing the bread and butter for 3 into as many portions as there were children, "you had better look sharp with your breakfast, for the horn will blow in a minute or 2, and then every boy leaves off." Permission being thus given to fall to, the boys began to eat voraciously and in desperate haste, while the schoolmaster, who was in high good humor after his meal, picked his teeth with a fork and looked smilingly on. In a very short time the horn was heard. "I thought it wouldn't be long," said Squeers, jumping up and producing a little basket from under the seat. "Put what you haven't had time to eat in here, boys. You'll want it on the road." Nicholas was considerably startled by these very economical arrangements, but he had no time to reflect upon them, for the little boys had to be got up to the top of the coach, and their boxes had to be brought out and put in, and Mr. Squeers' luggage was to be seen carefully deposited in the boot, and all these offices were in his department. He was in the full heat and bustle of concluding these operations, when his uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickelby, accosted him. "Oh, here you are, sir," said Ralph. "Here are your mother and sister, sir." "Where?" cried Nicholas, looking hastily round. "Here," replied his uncle. "Having too much money and nothing at all to do with it, they were paying a hackney coach as I came up, sir." We were afraid of being too late to see him before he went away from us, said Mrs. Nickleby, embracing her son, heedless of the unconcerned lookers-on in the coach-yard. Very good, ma'am, returned Ralph. You're the best judge, of course. I merely said that you were paying a hackney coach. I never pay a hackney coach, ma'am. I never hire one. I haven't been in a hackney coach of my own hiring for 30 years, and I hope I shan't be for 30 more if I live as long. I should never have forgiven myself if I had not seen him, said Mrs. Nickleby. Poor dear boy, going away without his breakfast, too, because he feared to distress us. Mighty fine, certainly, said Ralph, with great testiness. When I first went to business, ma'am, I took a penny loaf and a half-porth of milk for my breakfast as I walked to the city every morning. What do you say to that, ma'am? Breakfast? Bah! Now, Nickelby, said Squeers, coming up at the moment, buttoning his greatcoat. I think you'd better get up behind. I'm afraid one of them boys falling off, and then there's £20 a year gone. Dear Nicholas, whispered Kate, touching her brother's arm. Who is that vulgar man? Eh? Growled Ralph, whose quick ears had caught the inquiry. Do you wish to be introduced to Mr. Squeers, my dear? That the schoolmaster? No, uncle, oh no, replied Kate, shrinking back. I'm sure I heard you say as much, my dear, retorted Ralph in his cold, sarcastic manner. Mr. Squeers, here is my niece, Nicholas's sister. Very glad to make your acquaintance, miss, said Squeers, raising his hat an inch or two. I wish Mrs. Squeers took cows, and we had you for a teacher. I don't know, though, whether she mightn't grow jealous if we had. Ha ha ha! If the proprietor of Dotheboys Hall could have known what was passing in his assistant's breast at that moment, he would have discovered, with some surprise, that he was as near being soundly pummeled as he had ever been in his life. Kate Nickleby, having a quicker perception of her brother's emotions, led him gently aside, and thus prevented Mr. Squeers from being impressed with the fact in a peculiarly, I can't talk today. I'm sorry, in a disagreeable manner. I don't know why I can't pronounce that word at this particular moment. My dear Nicholas, said the young lady, who is this man? What kind of place can it be that you're going to? I hardly know, Kate, replied Nicholas, pressing his sister's hand. I suppose the Yorkshire folks are rather rough and uncultivated, that's all. But this person, urged Kate, is my employer, or master, or whatever the proper name may be, replied Nicholas quickly, and I was an ass to take his coarseness ill. They are looking this way, and it is time I was in my place. Bless you, love, and good-bye. Mother, look forward to our meeting again some day. Uncle, farewell. Thank you heartily for all you have done, and all you mean to do. Quite ready, sir. With these hasty adieux, Nicholas mounted nimbly to his seat, and waved his hand as gallantly as if his heart went with it. At this moment, when the coachman and guard were comparing notes for the last time before starting, on the subject of the waybill, when porters were screwing out the last reluctant sixpences, itinerant newsmen making the last offer of a morning paper, and the horses giving the last impatient rattle to their harness, Nicholas felt somebody pulling softly at his leg. He looked down, and there stood Newman Noggs, who pushed up into his hand a dirty letter. What's this? Inquired Nicholas. Hush, rejoined Noggs, pointing to Mr. Ralph Nickelby, who was saying a few earnest words to Squeers, a short distance off. Take it. Read it. Nobody knows. That's all. Stop, cried Nicholas. No, replied Noggs. Nicholas cried stop again, but Newman Noggs was gone. A minute's bustle, a banging of the coach doors, a swaying of the vehicle to one side as the heavy coachman and still heavier guard climbed into their seats, a cry of all right, a few notes from the horn, and a hasty glance of two sorrowful faces below, and the hard features of Mr. Ralph Nickelby, and the coach was gone too, and rattling over the stones of Smithfield. The little boy's legs being too short to admit of their feet resting upon anything as they sat, and the little boys' bodies being consequently in imminent hazard of being jerked off the coach, Nicholas had enough to do over the stones to hold them on. Between the manual exertion and the mental anxiety attendant upon this task, he was not a little relieved when the coach stopped at the Peacock at Islington. He was still more relieved when a hearty-looking gentleman with a very good-humored face and a very fresh color got up behind and proposed to take the other corner of the seat. "If we put some of these youngsters in the middle," said the newcomer, "they'll be safer in case they're going to sleep, eh?" "If you'll have the goodness, sir," replied Squeers, "that'll be the very thing. Nicholas, take 3 of them boys between you and the gentleman. Belling and the youngest Snolly can sit between me and the guard." "3 children," said Squeers, explaining to the stranger. "Books is 2. "I have not the least objection, I am sure," said the fresh-colored gentleman. "I have a brother who wouldn't object to book his 6 children as 2 as at any butcher's or baker's in the kingdom, I dare say. Far from it." "6 children, sir!" exclaimed Squeers. "Yes, and all boys," replied the stranger. "Mr. Nickelby," said Squeers, in great haste, "catch hold of that basket. Let me give you a card, sir, of an establishment where those 6 boys can be brought up in an enlightened, liberal, and moral manner, with no mistake at all about it, for 20 guineas a year each. 20 guineas, sir, or I'd take all the boys together upon an average right through, and say £100 a year for the lot." "Oh," said the gentleman, glancing at the card. "You are the Mr. Squeers mentioned here, I presume?" "Yes, I am, sir," replied the worthy pedagogue. "Mr. Wackford Squeers is my name, and I'm very far from being ashamed of it. These are some of my boys, sir. That's one of my assistants, sir. Mr. Nickleby's, a gentleman's son and a good scholar, mathematical, classical, and commercial. We don't do things by halves at our shop. All manner of learning my boys take down, sir. The expense is never thought of, and they get paternal treatment and washing in." "Upon my word," said the gentleman, glancing at Nicholas with a half-smile, and a more than half expression of surprise, "these are advantages indeed." "You may say that, sir," rejoined Squeers, thrusting his hands into his greatcoat pockets. "The most unexceptionable references are given and required. I wouldn't take a reference with any boy that wasn't responsible for the payment of £5.5 a quarter. No, not if you went down on your knees and asked me, with the tears running down your face, to do it." "Highly considerate," said the passenger. "It is my great aim and end to be considerate, sir," rejoined Squeers. "Snolly, Junior, if you don't leave off chattering your teeth and shaking with the cold, I'll warm you with a severe thrashing in about half a minute's time." "Sit fast here, gentlemen," said the guard as he clambered up. "All right behind there, Dick?" cried the coachman. "All right," was the reply. "Off she goes." And off she did go, if coaches be feminine, amidst a loud flourish from the guard's horn, and the calm approval of all the judges of coaches and coach horses congregated at the Peacock, but more especially of the helpers, who stood, with the cloths over their arms, watching the coach till it disappeared, and then lounged admiringly stablewards, bestowing various gruff encomiums on the beauty of the turnout. When the guard, who was a stout old Yorkshireman, had blown himself quite out of breath, he put the horn into a little tunnel of a basket fastened to the coach side for the purpose, and giving himself a plentiful shower of blows on the chest and shoulders, observed it was uncommon cold. After which he demanded of every person separately whether he was going right through, and if not, where he was going. Satisfactory replies being made to these queries, he surmised that the roads were pretty heavy arter the fall last night, and took the liberty of asking whether any of them gentlemen carried a snuff-box. It happening that nobody did, he remarked with a mysterious air that he had heard a medical gentleman as he went down to Grantham last week, saying how that snuff-taking was bad for the eyes, but for his part he had never found it so, and what he said was that everybody should speak as they found. Nobody attempting to controvert this position, he took a small brown paper parcel out of his hat, and putting on a pair of horn spectacles, the writing being crabbed, read the direction half a dozen times over. Having done which, he consigned the parcel to its old place, put up his spectacles again, and stared at everybody in turn. After this, he took another blow at the horn by way of refreshment, and having now exhausted his usual topics of conversation, folded his arms as well as he could in so many coats, and falling into a solemn silence, looked carelessly at the familiar objects which met his eye on every side as the coach rolled on. The only things he seemed to care for being horses and droves of cattle, which he scrutinized with a critical air as they were passed upon the road. And we'll go ahead and take our... No, I have not tried replacing or upgrading my tongue. Also, I fear it would change my voice. And, I don't know. I'm not sure how I might sound then. I think I'll just have to practice saying peculiar. Hey, I got it that time. Anyway, we'll take about 5 minutes. I'm going to warm up my tea. And if anybody has any questions or any comments on the book or the reading so far, I'm open to any questions anyone has. And let's set the timer for 5 minutes. And there we go. Well, I could certainly change the modulation of it. And I wouldn't want to disappoint Alex if he's still here. He does so seem to enjoy my voice. Are you still with us, Alex? I'm a secret agent. Okay. I can see that. Sure. Yeah. I could be the secret agent, man. Hey, we might even be able to read some of the Bond stories on here. I think some of those are public domain. Maybe. I did have a thought on the public domain books and the non-ones, more modern stuff. And I think... Oh, I'm Boris. Okay. Меня зовут Boris Ivanovich. Yes, I had a thought. So I was thinking that what I could do is once we hit affiliate, I could do readings for subscribers, and we could read some more modern books, requests from subscribers, and read them in the Discord. By the way, I'll be adding a Discord here shortly. I've almost got it done getting set up. I'm just messing with some of the bots right now. But then we'll have a Discord where we can hang out, and if you guys want to jump in on some of the like Among Us that we tend to play after the stream or some of that stuff, you can get a chance to stabby Vela. She deserves the stabby. She's very sus. And I was thinking that I might go ahead and get the Twitch Prime thing that lets us do watch parties. Speaking of, if you are enjoying the stream, please do click that follow button and help us get to affiliate. We are 16 follows away, which for not even 2 weeks in seems pretty good to me. I'm really, really humbled and grateful for all the follows and support that I've gotten so far. It's been not as scary doing this as I thought it would be. I honestly was kind of afraid that I'd just be talking completely into the darkness and nobody would be listening. But I seem to have gotten quite a few views and messages for it and that kind of thing. So thank you, everyone. I really do appreciate that. You've made this much more enjoyable. Yes, Vela, I briefly oopsied and modded the spammer because I clicked the wrong button because it was right next to the ban button. But I quickly unmodded the spammer and then banned him. But yes, I messed up. Vela's been very helpful. She catches me every time I screw up. Like the one time that I left my mic muted for the first few minutes of the stream. That was embarrassing. But by and large, things have gone fairly well with this. I was also thinking about my dog, Kana. I was thinking about setting up a green screen and taking short videos of her doing tricks and that sort of thing, and then converting those into GIFs to use for the alerts and follow notifications and subscriber notifications and stuff. Because she's very cute and very sweet, and I think that'd be pretty cool. But you need more of the Kana? Well, I may post some pictures of her to the Discord too, so we can share that. In any case, it looks like intermission is up. Let me just pour a little more tea in my mug. I have a ceramic teapot with me this time, so I get lots of cups of tea while I read. All in all, it is not a bad way to spend an evening, reading to all of you and drinking tea. So, let's return to the story. All right. The weather was intensely and bitterly cold. A great deal of snow fell from time to time, and the wind was intolerably keen. Oh, and return to the pattern. Well, that's a cool one. Mr. Squeers got down at almost every stage to stretch his legs, as he said, and as he always came back from such exertions with a very red nose, and composed himself to sleep directly, there is reason to suppose that he derived great benefit from the process. The little pupils, having been stimulated with the remains of their breakfast, and further invigorated by sundry small cups of a curious cordial carried by Mr. Squeers, which tasted very like toast and water put into a brandy bottle by mistake, went to sleep, woke, shivered, and cried, as their feelings prompted. Nicholas and the good-tempered man found so many things to talk about that between conversing together and cheering up the boys, the time passed with them as rapidly as it could under such adverse circumstances. I gotta remember to hold my pinky up. No, I don't think I'll do that. I think I'll just hold the mug and drink from it. I don't think I need to do the elevated pinky. I'm not actually drinking from a little teacup. It's a big mug that has lines from a bunch of different novels on it, actually. I've got some really cool mugs that I drink from. I've got one that's nothing but Shakespearean insults. I like that mug. Maybe I'll post some pictures of them one of these days. In any case, so the day wore on. At Eton, Slocum, there was a good coach dinner, of which the box, the four fronts outside, the one inside, Nicholas, the good-tempered man, and Mr. Squeers partook, while the 5 little boys were put to thaw by the fire and regaled with sandwiches. A stage or two further on, the lamps were lighted, and a great to-do occasioned by the taking up, at a roadside inn, of a very fastidious lady with an infinite variety of cloaks and small parcels, who loudly lamented, for the behoof of the outsides, the non-arrival of her own carriage, which was to have taken her on, and made the guards solemnly promise to stop every green chariot he saw coming, which, as it was a dark night and he was sitting with his face the other way, that officer undertook with many fervent asseverations to do. Lastly, the fastidious lady, finding there was a solitary gentleman inside, had a small lamp lighted which she carried in reticule, and being after much trouble shut in, the horses were put into a brisk canter, and the coach was once more in rapid motion. The night and the snow came on together, and dismal enough they were. There was no sound to be heard but the howling of the wind, for the noise of the wheels and the tread of the horses' feet were rendered inaudible by the thick coating of snow which covered the ground, and was fast increasing every moment. The streets of Stamford were deserted as they passed through the town, and its old churches rose, frowning and dark from the whitened ground. 20 miles further on, 2 of the front outside passengers, wisely availing themselves of their arrival at one of the best inns in England, turned in for the night at the George at Grantham. The remainder wrapped themselves more closely in their coats and cloaks, and leaving the light and warmth of the town behind them, pillowed themselves against the luggage, and prepared, with many half-suppressed moans, again to encounter the piercing blast which swept across the open country. They were little more than a stage out of Grantham, or about halfway between it and Newark, when Nicholas, who had been asleep for a short time, was suddenly roused by a violent jerk which nearly threw him from his seat. Grasping the rail, he found that the coach had sunk greatly on one side, though it was still dragged forward by the horses, and while, confused by their plunging and the loud screams of the lady inside, he hesitated for an instant whether to jump off or not, the vehicle turned easily over and relieved him from all further uncertainty by flinging him into the road. Well, that's not great. I tell you, I've driven a car in those kinds of conditions, and even that wasn't much fun. I've actually had to pull off and wait for the snow to subside at some time because it was full whiteout. Couldn't see anything at all, couldn't see the road, the markings, nothing. And unfortunately, I was driving near the water as well, and it was covered over with ice and snow, so you couldn't actually see where the water began and the land ended, and that was fairly frightening in the middle of the night. Chapter 6. Yeah, it's not something that I would repeat willingly. Chapter 6, in which the occurrence of the accident mentioned in the last chapter affords an opportunity to a couple of gentlemen to tell stories against each other. And actually, if you'll bear with me just a moment, I'm getting a bit warm, so I'm going to take my hoodie off. One moment. There we go. Much better. Yeah, it's not that kind of stream there, fella. And, yeah, that would definitely be limited to subscribers only. On an entirely different venue. Oh, you two are terrible. All right. No, there's definitely not going to be that kind of show on Twitch. Twitch would ban me in a second for that. But I will read stories for you. So, "Whoa-ho!" cried the guard, on his legs in a minute, and running to the leaders' heads. "Is there only gentlemen there as can lend a hand here? Keep quiet, dang ye! Whoa-ho!" "What's the matter?" demanded Nicholas, looking sleepily up. "Matter enough for Owen night," replied the guard, and I'm saying these exactly as they're written, by the way. "Dang the Walleye Bay, he gone mad with glory, I think, 'cause 'twas over. Here, can you lend a hand? Dommed it, I had Dean if all my bones were broken." And that's exactly how it was written. Here, cried Nicholas, staggering to his feet. I'm ready. I'm only a little abroad, that's all. Hold him tight, cried the guard. While our coot traces. Hang on to him somehow. Well done, my lord. That's it. Let him go now. Dang 'em. They're all gang warm fast enough. In truth, the animals were no sooner released than they trotted back, with much deliberation, to the stable they had just left behind, which was distant not a mile behind. Can you blow a horn? Asked the guard, disengaging from one of the coach lamps. I dare say I can, replied Nicholas. Then just blow away into that one as lies on the ground, fit to waken the dead, will ye? Said the man, while I stop some of this here squealing inside. Comin'. Don't make that noise, woman. Oh, I could read all the book like that if you really wanted. As the man spoke, he proceeded to wrench open the uppermost door of the coach, while Nicholas, seizing the horn, awoke the echoes far and wide with one of the most extraordinary performances on that instrument ever heard by mortal ears. It had its effect, however, not only in rousing such of their fall, but in summoning assistance to their relief, for lights gleamed in the distance, and people were already astir. That's a money-making idea. Accents on demand. You can donate to ask me to do an accent or to stop. Could do something like that. In fact, a man on horseback galloped down before the passengers were well collected together, and a careful investigation being instituted. It appeared that the lady inside had broken her lamp, and the gentleman his head, that the two front outsides had escaped with black eyes, the box with a bloody nose, the coachman with a contusion on the temple, Mr. Squeers with a portmanteau bruise on his back, and the remaining passengers without any injury at all, thanks to the softness of the snowdrift in which they had been overturned. These facts were no sooner thoroughly ascertained than the lady gave several indications of fainting, but being forewarned that if she did, she must be carried on some gentleman's shoulder to the nearest public house, she prudently thought better of it, and walked back with the rest. They found on reaching it that it was a lonely place with no very great accommodation in the way of apartments, that portion of its resources being all comprised in one public room with a sanded floor and a chair or two. However, a large faggot and a plentiful supply of coals being heaped upon the fire, the appearance of things was not long in mending, and by the time they had washed off all effaceable marks of the late accident, the room was warm and light, which was a most agreeable exchange for the cold and darkness out of doors. Well, Mr. Nickelby, said Squeers, insinuating himself into the warmest corner, you did very right to catch hold of them horses. I should have done it myself if I had come to in time, but I'm very glad you did it. You did it very well, very well. So well, said the merry-faced gentleman, who did not seem to approve very much of the patronizing tone adopted by Squeers, that if they had not been firmly checked when they were, you would most probably have had no brains left to teach with. This remark called up a discourse relative to the promptitude Nicholas had displayed, and he was overwhelmed with compliments and commendations. I am very glad to have escaped, of course, observed Squeers. Every man is glad when he escapes from danger. But if any one of my charges had been hurt, if I had been prevented from restoring any one of those little boys to his parents, whole and sound as I received him, what would have been my feelings? Why, the wheel atop my head would have been far preferable to it. Are they all brothers, sir? Inquired the lady, who had carried the Davy or safety lamp. In one sense they are, ma'am, replied Squeers, diving into his great coat pocket for cards. They are all under the same parental and affectionate treatment. Mrs. Squeers and myself are a mother and father to every one of them. Mr. Nickelby, hand the lady them cards, and offer these to the gentleman. Perhaps they might know of some parents that would be glad to avail themselves of the establishment. Expressing himself to this effect, Mr. Squeers, who lost no opportunity of advertising gratuitously, placed his hands upon his knees and looked at, at the pupils with as much benignity as he could possibly affect, while Nicholas, blushing with shame, handed round the cards as directed. "I hope you suffer no inconvenience from the overturn, ma'am," said the merry-faced gentleman, addressing the fastidious lady, as though he were charitably desirous to change the subject. "No bodily inconvenience," replied the lady. "No mental inconvenience, I hope." "The subject is a very painful one to my feelings, sir," replied the lady with strong emotion, "and I beg you, as a gentleman, not to refer to it." "Dear me," said the merry-faced gentleman, looking merrier still, "I merely intended to inquire." "I hope no inquiries will be made," said the lady, "or I shall be compelled to throw myself on the protection of the other gentleman. Landlord, pray direct a boy to keep watch outside the door, and if a green chariot passes in the direction of Grantham, to stop it instantly." The people of the house were evidently overcome by this request, and when the lady charged the boy to remember, as a means of identifying the expected green chariot, they would have a coachman with a gold-laced hat on the box, and a footman, most probably in silk stockings. Behind, the attentions of the good woman of the inn were redoubled. Even the box passenger caught the infection, and, growing wonderfully deferential, immediately inquired whether there was not very good society in that neighborhood, to which the lady replied yes, there was, in a manner which sufficiently implied that she moved at the very tip-top and summit of it all. "As the guard has gone on horseback to Grantham to get another coach," said the good-tempered gentleman, when they had been all sitting round the fire for some time in silence, "and as he must be gone a couple of hours at the very least, I propose a bowl of hot punch. What say you, sir?" This question was addressed to the broken-headed inside, who was a man of very genteel appearance, dressed in mourning. He was not past the middle age, but his hair was grey. It seemed to have been prematurely turned by care or sorrow. He readily acceded to the proposal, and appeared to be prepossessed by the frank good nature of the individual from whom it emanated. This latter personage took upon himself the office of tapster when the punch was ready, and after dispensing it all round, led the conversation to the antiquities of York, with which both he and the grey-haired gentleman appeared to be very well acquainted. When this topic flagged, he turned with a smile to the grey-headed gentleman, and asked if he could sing. "I cannot indeed," replied the gentleman, smiling in his turn. "That's a pity," said the owner of the good-humoured countenance. "Is there nobody here who can sing a song to lighten the time?" The passengers, one and all, protested that they could not, that they wished they could, that they couldn't remember the words of anything without the book, and so forth. "Perhaps the lady would not object," said the president with great respect, and a merry twinkle in his eye. "Some little Italian thing out of the last opera brought out in town would be most acceptable, I am sure." As the lady condescended to make no reply, but tossed her head contemptuously, and murmured some further expression of surprise regarding the absence of the green chariot, one or two voices urged upon the president himself the propriety of making an attempt for the general benefit. "I would if I could," said he of the good-tempered face, "for I hold that in this, as in all other cases where people who are strangers to each other are thrown unexpectedly together, they should endeavor to render themselves as pleasant, for the joint sake of the little community, as possible." "I wish the maxim were more generally acted on in all cases," said the grey-headed gentleman. "I'm glad to hear it," returned the other. "Perhaps, as you can't sing, you'll tell us a story." See, story time is awesome. "Nay, I should ask you." "After you, I will, with pleasure." "Indeed," said the grey-haired gentleman, smiling. "Well, let it be so. I fear the turn of my thoughts is not calculated to lighten the time you must pass here, but you have brought this upon yourselves, and shall judge. We were speaking of York Minster just now. My story shall have some reference to it. Let us call it The 5 Sisters of York." We're getting meta now, story within a story. After a murmur of approbation from the other passengers, during which the fastidious lady drank a glass of punch unobserved, the grey-headed gentleman thus went on. A great many years ago, for the 15th century was scarce 2 years old at the time, and King Henry IV sat upon the throne of England, there dwelt in the ancient city of York 5 maiden sisters, the subjects of my tale. These 5 sisters were all of surpassing beauty. The eldest was in her 23rd year, the second a year younger, the third a year younger than the second, and the fourth a year younger than the third. They were tall, stately figures, with dark, flashing eyes and hair of jet. Dignity and grace were in their every movement, and the fame of their great beauty had spread through all the country round. But if the 4 elder sisters were lovely, how beautiful was the youngest, a fair creature of 16. The blushing tints and the soft bloom on the fruit, or the delicate painting on the flower, are not more exquisite than was the blending of the rose and lily in her gentle face, or the deep blue of her eye. The vine, in all its elegant luxuriance, is not more graceful than were the clusters of rich brown hair that sported round her brow. If we all had hearts like those which beat so lightly in the bosoms of the young and beautiful, what a heaven this earth would be! If, while our bodies grow old and withered, our hearts could but retain their early youth and freshness, of what avail would be our sorrows and sufferings? But the faint image of Eden, which is stamped upon them in childhood, chafes and rubs in our rough struggles with the world, and soon wears away, too often to leave nothing but a mournful blank remaining. The heart of this fair girl bounded with joy and gladness, devoted attachment to her sisters, and a fervent love of all beautiful things in nature were its pure affections. Her gleesome voice and merry laugh were the sweetest music of their home. She was its very light and life. The brightest flowers in the garden were reared by her. The caged birds sang when they heard her voice, and pined when they missed its sweetness. Alice, dear Alice, what living thing within the sphere of her gentle witchery could fail to love her? It sounds like something straight out of a Disney movie. I can just picture her now, all the birds landing on her shoulders and tweeting at her, the mice gathering round, and the deer coming out of the forest and whatnot. You may seek in vain now for the spot on which these sisters lived, for the very names have passed away, and dusty antiquaries tell of them as a fable. But they dwelt in an old wooden house, old even in those days, with overhanging gables and balconies of rudely carved oak, which stood within a pleasant orchard, and was surrounded by a rough stone wall, whence a stout archer might have winged an arrow to St. Mary's Abbey. I don't know, the group living in a house in the woods sounds a bit Snow White, 7 Dwarfs to me. And same with the jet black hair. The old abbey flourished then, and the 5 sisters, living on its fair domains, paid yearly dues to the black monks of St. Benedict, to which fraternity it belonged. It was a bright and sunny morning in the pleasant time of summer, when one of those black monks emerged from the abbey portal and bent his steps toward the house of the fair sisters. Heaven above was blue, and earth beneath was green. The river glistened like a path of diamonds in the sun. The birds poured forth their songs from the shady trees. The lark soared high above the waving corn, and the deep buzz of insects filled the air. Everything looked gay and smiling, but the holy man walked gloomily on, with his eyes bent upon the ground. The beauty of the earth is but a breath, and man is but a shadow. What sympathy should a holy preacher have with either? With eyes bent upon the ground, then, or only raised enough to prevent his stumbling over such obstacles as lay in his way, the religious man moved slowly forward until he reached a small postern in the wall of the sisters' orchard, through which he passed, closing it behind him. The noise of soft voices and conversation, and of merry laughter, fell upon his ears ere he had advanced many paces. and raising his eyes higher than was his humble wont, he descried, at no great distance, the 5 sisters seated on the grass, with Alice in the center, all busily plying their customary task of embroidering. "Save you, fair daughters," said the friar, and fair in truth they were. Even a monk might have loved them as choice masterpieces of his Maker's hand. The sisters saluted the holy man with becoming reverence, and the eldest motioned to him to a mossy seat beside them. But the good friar shook his head and bumped himself down on a very hard stone, at which, no doubt, approving angels were gratified. "You were merry, daughter," said the monk. "You know how light of heart sweet Alice is," replied the eldest sister, passing her fingers through the tresses of the smiling girl. "And what joy and cheerfulness it wakes up within us to see all nature beaming in brightness and sunshine, father," added Alice, blushing beneath the stern look of the recluse. The monk answered naught, save by a grave inclination of the head, and the sisters pursued their task in silence. "Still wasting the precious hours," said the monk at length, turning to the eldest sister as he spoke. "Still wasting the precious hours on this vain trifling. Alas, alas, that the few bubbles on the surface of eternity, all that heaven wills we should see of the dark, deep stream, should be so lightly scattered." "Father," urged the maiden, pausing, as did each of the others, in her busy task, "we have prayed at matins. Our daily alms have been distributed at the gate. The sick peasants have been tended. All our morning tasks have been performed. I hope our occupation is a blameless one." "See here," said the friar, taking the frame from her hand, "an intricate winding of gaudy colors, without purpose or object, unless it be that one day it is destined for some vain ornament, to minister to the pride of your frail and giddy sex. Day after day has been employed upon this senseless task, and yet it is not half accomplished. The shade of each departed day falls upon our graves, and the worm exults as he beholds it, to know that we are hastening thither. Daughters, is there no better way to pass the fleeting hours?" The 4 elder sisters cast down their eyes, as if abashed by the holy man's reproof, but Alice raised hers and bent them mildly on the friar. "Our dear mother," said the maiden, "heaven rest her soul." "Amen," cried the friar in a deep voice. "Our dear mother," faltered the fair Alice, "was living when these long tasks began, and bade us, when she should be no more, ply them in all discretion and cheerfulness in our leisure hours. She said that if in harmless mirth and maidenly pursuits we passed those hours together, they would prove the happiest and most peaceful of our lives, and that if, in latter times, we went forth into the world, and mingled with its cares and trials, if allured by its temptations and dazzled by its glitter, we ever forgot that love and duty, which should bind in holy ties the children of one loved parent, a glance at the old work of our common girlhood would awaken good thoughts of bygone days and soften our hearts to affection and love." "Alice speaks truly, father," said the elder sister, somewhat proudly, and so saying, she resumed her work, as did the others. It was a kind of sampler of large size that each sister had before her. The device was of complex and intricate description, and the pattern and colors of all 5 were the same. The sisters bent gracefully over their work. The monk, resting his chin upon his hands, looked from one to the other in silence. "How much better," he said at length, "to shun all such thoughts and chances, and in the peaceful shelter of the church, devote your lives to heaven. Infancy, childhood, the prime of life, and old age wither as rapidly as they crowd upon each other. Think how human dust rolls onward to the tomb, and turning your faces steadily toward that goal, avoid the cloud which takes its rise among the pleasures of the world, and cheats the senses of their votaries. The veil, daughters, the veil." Man, this guy just doesn't want to live, does he? "Never, sisters," cried Alice. "Barter not the light and air of heaven, and the freshness of earth, and all the beautiful things which breathe upon it, for the cold cloister and the cell. Nature's own blessings are the proper goods of life, and we may share them sinlessly together. To die is our heavy portion, but oh, let us die with life about us. When our cold hearts cease to beat, let warm hearts be beating near. Let our last look be upon the bounds which God has set to his own bright skies, and not on stone walls and bars of iron. Dear sisters, let us live and die, if you list, in this green garden's compass. Only shun the gloom and sadness of a cloister, and we shall be happy. The tears fell fast from the maiden's eyes as she closed her impassioned appeal, and hid her face in the bosom of her sister. Take comfort, Alice, said the eldest, kissing her fair forehead. The veil shall never cast its shadow on thy young brow. How say you, sisters? For yourselves you speak, and not for Alice or for me. The sisters, as with one accord, cried that their lot was cast together, and that there were dwellings for peace and virtue beyond the convent's walls. Father, said the eldest lady, rising with dignity, you hear our final resolve. The same pious care which enriched the Abbey of St. Mary, and left us orphans to its holy guardianship, directed that no constraint should be opposed upon our inclinations, but that we should be free to live according to our choice. Let us hear no more of this, we pray you. Sisters, it is nearly noon. Let us take shelter until evening. With a reverence to the friar, the lady rose and walked toward the house, hand in hand with Alice. The other sisters followed. The holy man, who had often urged the same point before, but had never met with so direct a repulse, walked some little distance behind, with his eyes bent upon the earth, and his lips moving as if in prayer. As the sisters reached the porch, he quickened his pace and called upon them to stop. Stay, said the monk, raising his right hand in the air, and directing an angry glance by turns at Alice and the eldest sister. Stay, and hear from me what these recollections are, which you would cherish above eternity, and awaken, if in mercy they slumbered, by means of idle toys. The memory of earthly things is charged in afterlife with bitter disappointment, affliction, death, with dreary change and wasting sorrow. The time will one day come when a glance at those unmeaning baubles will tear open deep wounds in the hearts of some among you, and strike to your inmost souls. When that hour arrives, and mark me, come it will, turn from the world to which you clung, to the refuge which you spurned. Find me the cell which shall be colder than the fire of mortals grows, when dimmed by calamity and trial, and there weep for the dreams of youth. These things are heaven's will, not mine, said the friar, subduing his voice as he looked round upon the shrinking girls. The Virgin's blessings be upon you, daughters. With these words, he disappeared through the postern, and the sisters hastening into the house were seen no more that day. Holy crap, Meg. Thank you so much. Guys, this is Meg. She's been I was in the book. I was reading the book. She's been the one helping me out so much with streaming and learning all this stuff. So a raid is what? Okay, Meg, how do I do the shout out for you? Because I did the /SO, which I thought was shout out, but apparently that's not it. But hi, everybody that Meg brought. How is everyone? Oh, the exclamation. Okay. Hey, there we go. Awesome. So we're reading a little bit of Charles Dickens this evening and having story time. Stream a few times a week, and we're reading a few different novels. But it's just kind of a relaxing time. The thing on the screen over here is this kinetic art installation that traces different mathematical patterns in the sand. It's kind of like an animated Zen garden kind of a thing. So you just kind of get a chance to chill out and relax over here. But Thank you so much for the raid, Meg. I really appreciate it. That's awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to go back to the story, but yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't notice right away. How long did it take me? The heck you say it did not take 30 minutes. You can't fool me. I look over at the chat way more often than 30 minutes. Hey, Nameless, glad you could make it. How are you? Oh, you were not here for 20 minutes. No way. You're being mean to me now. All right. Okay. So, but seriously, back to the story. Because we got about 20 minutes left in the stream. So let's see if we can at least make it to the end of the chapter. But nature will smile, though priests may frown. And next day the sun shone brightly, and on the next, and the next again. And in the morning's glare and the evening's soft repose, the five sisters still walked or worked, or beguiled the time by cheerful conversation in their quiet orchard. Time passed away as a tale that is told, faster indeed than many tales that are told, of which number I fear this may be one. The house of the five sisters stood where it did, and the same trees cast their pleasant shade upon the orchard grass. The sisters too were there, and lovely as at first, but a change had come over their dwelling. Sometimes there was the clash of armor, and the gleaming of the moon on caps of steel, and at others, jaded coursers were spurred up to the gate, and a female form glided hurriedly forth, as if eager to demand tidings of the weary messenger. A goodly train of knights and ladies lodged one night within the abbey walls, and next day rode away, with two of the fair sisters among them. Then horsemen began to come less frequently, and seemed to bring bad tidings when they did. And at length they ceased to come at all, and footsore peasants slunk to the gate after sunset, and did their errand there by stealth. Once a vassal was dispatched in haste to the abbey at dead of night, and when morning came, there were sounds of woe and wailing in the sisters' house. And after this, a mournful silence fell upon it, and knight or lady, horse or armor was seen about it no more. There was a sullen darkness in the sky, and the sun had gone angrily down, tinting the dull clouds with the last traces of his wrath, when the same black monk walked slowly on, with folded arms, within a stone's throw of the abbey. A blight had fallen on the trees and shrubs, and the wind, at length beginning to break the unnatural stillness that had prevailed all day, sighed heavily from time to time, as though foretelling in grief the ravages of the coming storm. The bat skimmed in fantastic flights through the heavy air, and the ground was alive with crawling things, whose instinct brought them forth to swell and fatten in the rain. No longer were the friars' eyes directed to the earth. They were cast abroad, and roamed from point to point, as if the gloom and desolation of the scene found a quick response in his own bosom. Again he paused near the sisters' house, and again he entered by the postern. But not again did his ear encounter the sound of laughter, or his eyes rest upon the beautiful figures of the five sisters. All was silent and deserted. The boughs of the trees were bent and broken, and the grass had grown long and rank. No light feet had pressed it for many, many a day. With the indifference or abstraction of one well accustomed to the change, the monk glided into the house and entered a low, dark room. 4 sisters sat there. Their black garments made their pale faces whiter still, and time and sorrow had worked deep ravages. They were stately yet, but the flesh and pride of beauty were gone. And Alice, where was she? In heaven. The monk, Even the monk could bear with some grief here, for it was long since these sisters had met, and there were furrows in their blanched faces which years could never plough. He took his seat in silence, and motioned them to continue their speech. "They are here, sisters," said the elder lady in a trembling voice. "I have never borne to look upon them since, and now I blame myself for my weakness. What is there in her memory that we should dread? To call up our old days should be a solemn pleasure yet." She glanced at the monk as she spoke, and opening a cabinet, brought forth the 5 frames of work, completed long before. Her step was firm, but her hand trembled as she produced the last one, and when the feelings of the other sisters gushed forth at the sight of it, her pent-up tears made way, and she sobbed, "God bless her!" The monk rose and advanced towards them. "It was almost the last thing she touched in health," he said in a low voice. "It was," cried the elder lady, weeping bitterly. The monk turned to the second sister. "The gallant youth who looked into thine eyes, and hung upon thy very breath, when first he saw thee intent upon this pastime, lies buried on a plain, whereof the turf is red with blood. Rusty fragments of armor, once brightly burnished, lie rotting on the ground, and are as little distinguishable for his as are the bones that crumble in the mold." The lady groaned and wrung her hands. "The policy of courts," he continued, turning to the 2 other sisters, "drew ye from your peaceful home to scenes of revelry and splendor. The same policy, and the restless ambition of proud and fiery men, have sent ye back, widowed maidens and humbled outcasts. Do I speak truly?" The sobs of the 2 sisters were their only reply. "There is little need," said the monk, with a meaning look, "to fritter away the time in gewgaws which shall raise up the pale ghosts of hopes of early years. Bury them, heap penance and mortification on their heads, keep them down, and let the convent be their grave." The sisters asked for 3 days to deliberate, and felt that night as though the veil were indeed the fitting shroud for their dead joys. But morning came again, and though the boughs of the orchard trees drooped and ran wild upon the ground, it was the same orchard still. The grass was coarse and high, but there was yet the spot on which they had so often sat together, when change and sorrow were but names. There was every walk and nook which Alice had made glad, and in the minster nave was one flat stone beneath which she slept in peace. And could they, remembering how her young heart had sickened at the thought of cloistered walls, look upon her grave in garbs which would chill the very ashes within it? Could they bow down in prayer, and when all heaven turned to hear them, bring the dark shade of sadness on one angel's face? No. They sent abroad to artists of great celebrity in those times, and having obtained the church's sanction to their work of piety, caused to be executed, in 5 large compartments of richly stained glass, a faithful copy of their old embroidery work. These were fitted into a large window, until that time bare of ornament, and when the sun shone brightly, as she had so well loved to see it, the familiar patterns were reflected in their original colors, and throwing a stream of brilliant light upon the pavement, fell warmly on the name of Alice. For many hours and every day, the sisters paced slowly up and down the nave, or knelt by the side of the flat, broad stone. Only 3 were seen in the customary place, after many years, then but 2, and for a long time afterwards, but one solitary female bent with age. At length she came no more, and the stone bore 5 plain Christian names. That stone has worn away and been replaced by others, and many generations have come and gone since then. Time has softened down the colors, but the same stream of light still falls upon the forgotten tomb, of which no trace remains, and to this day the stranger is shown in York Cathedral an old window called the 5 Sisters. It is sad. "It's a melancholy tale," said the merry-faced gentleman, emptying his glass. "It is a tale of life, and life is made up of such sorrows," returned the other courteously. but in a grave and sad tone of voice. There are shades in all good pictures, but there are lights too, if we choose to contemplate them, said the gentleman with the merry face. The youngest sister in your tale was always light-hearted. And died early, said the other gently. She would have died earlier, perhaps, had she been less happy, said the first speaker, with much feeling. Do you think the sisters who loved her so well would have grieved the less if her life had been one of gloom and sadness? If anything could soothe the first sharp pain of a heavy loss, it would be, with me, the reflection that those I mourned, by being innocently happy here, and loving all about them, had prepared themselves for a purer and happier world. The sun does not shine upon this fair earth to meet frowning eyes. Depend upon it. I believe you are right, said the gentleman who had told the story. Believe, retorted the other. Can anybody doubt it? Take any subject of sorrowful regret, and see with how much pleasure it is associated. The recollection of past pleasure may become pain. It does, interposed the other. Well, it does. To remember happiness which cannot be restored is pain, but of a softened kind. Our recollections are unfortunately mingled with much that we deplore, and with many actions with which we bitterly repent. Still, in the most checkered life, I firmly think there are so many little rays of sunshine to look back upon, that I do not believe any mortal, unless he had put himself without the pail of hope, would deliberately drain a goblet of the waters of Lethe, if he had it in his power. The river Lethe is classical mythology. Its waters were said to cause you to forget if you drank of them. Possibly you are correct in that belief, said the gray-haired gentleman after a short reflection. I'm inclined to think you are. Why then, replied the other, the good in this state of existence preponderates over the bad. Let miscalled philosophers tell us what they will. If our affections be tried, our affections are our consolation and comfort, and memory, however sad, is the best and purest link between this world and a better. But come, I'll tell you a story of another kind. After a very brief silence, the merry-faced gentleman sent round the punch, and glancing slyly at the fastidious lady, who seemed desperately apprehensive that he was going to relate something improper, began. And I am totally going to end right there because it's going to be the best stopping point we can come to before the stream is over. So we will pick up with the merry-faced gentleman's story of the Baron of Grogswig on Saturday next. And something to look forward to, since it'll apparently be a happier story than the one we just read. Oh, I better run. But I couldn't finish it in 10 minutes, and I'd hate to stop partway through it. I feel that would be doing a disservice to it, don't you think? Well, I don't want to stop his story partway through. So, like I said, it's the best stopping place we're going to come to. Thank you, everybody who came to join the stream. And if any of you are the new people that came along with Megster, thank you for stopping by. And I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please click that follow button and you'll get announcements when I go live. I'm reading several books during the week. We're reading a mystery by Agatha Christie, and we're reading some H.P. Lovecraft on Fridays, which is a bit of a spookier story. We're reading some Conan. If any of you have ever seen the Arnold movie, these are some of the books that movie was based on, although Conan is a far more complex figure in the books than he is in the movie, which is kind of a nice change, actually. He's not just some brutish barbarian grunting and running about. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the movies, but a complex character is a lot nicer sometimes. And then, let's see. Is that it that we're reading right now? Mysterious Affair at Styles, People of the Black Circle, and some Lovecraft. Yep, that's it for the moment. Although one of the books that's been requested was The Count of Monte Cristo, which is a fantastic book. Might even lead us into some Three Musketeers or something like that as well. So that's one of the next books on the docket. If you do have any requests, you can message me either on Twitch, or my email is obviously.bedtime@gmail.com. That's also where my YouTube is, and those links are on the Twitch profile page. All the old content, the stuff that is aged out of Twitch, is also available there on YouTube. So if you're joining later in some of the books and you can't find like part 1 or part 2, they are on YouTube. I upload the stuff over there every time after the stream is over. Does anyone have any questions for me, suggestions, feedback, books they'd like to see me read in the future? Anything of that sort? 'Cause if not, I shall go looking for somebody I can raid myself. Generally brownies over cookies, and as far as a dollar bill stream, definitely after making affiliate. So, feel free to tell all your friends about the stream and see if you can help introduce a few more people that might want to follow and listen along. All right, let's see who else is streaming right now. All right, Alex was in here earlier. I think we'll go try rating him. He's streaming Dead by Daylight, so a little bit of a different fare. There is one other streamer that does Storytime that I found, Storytime Alley, but she is not on right now. Otherwise, I would go raid her, since that's a little bit more of a direct connection. But Alex seems to be good people. He's been encouraging me with the streaming, so we'll thank him by jumping over there real quick. He's a British streamer. Let's see. All right, let's see if I got this right.